everybody, today I am delighted to be driving the new and rather exciting C8 generation Chevrolet Corvette. This is a car with a big job to do because General Motors expects this to redefine perceptions of what a Corvette can be. To that end, this car features some of the most radical changes in Corvette history since the model switched from 6 to 8 cylinders. Having been a persistent rumour for nearly as long as the Corvette's been around, this is the first generation that's actually gone mid-engined. And so, there is a possibility that America's sports car has become America's supercar. But of perhaps even greater interest to us Brits, and I'm sure my Australian viewers too, is the fact that for the first time in Corvette history, this car is now available from the factory in right-hand drive. So I think the excitement surrounding the announcement of this car here in Britain was certainly well justified. You have to remember, a Corvette here is a very exotic thing. And more than that, here you had a car that was going to be a viable alternative to things like the Lotus Emira, offering a lot more in terms of power, features and tech for only a little bit more money. Sadly for Chevrolet, the car launched at just about the worst conceivable time, smack bang in the middle of a pandemic. However, despite a slightly shaky start, over in the States it's gone on to become a hit, and judging by my last visit, it has sold exceptionally well. And over there, the excitement is currently surrounding the Z06, the performance version, with its 5.5 litre naturally aspirated flat plane crank V8, meaning that it's a car that not only sounds like an old Ferrari, but it goes like a new one. But here in Britain, it's a different story. It feels like deliveries are only just beginning, and yet somehow the car seems already forgotten. So today I'm going to be talking about why that may be, what Chevrolet have possibly done wrong, and whether this is a car that deserves talking about. Because on paper, it does a heck of a lot right. I'm looking forward to this one. Enjoy. So then, let's talk you through the C8 generation Chevrolet Corvette Stingray. In case you weren't aware, the Stingray is the name for the base model. Above this, you now have the Z06, and potentially above that, you'll have something else, likely called the ZR1. And it's a Z because it's American. And it's Porsche, not Porsche, because I like to annoy those people. Anyway, as you can probably tell, the big news for the C8 is that for the first time in its 70-year history, the Corvette has finally gone mid-engined. This is not at all a new idea. In fact, the Corvette's inventor suggested it way back in the 1960s. In the 1990s, one idea that GM had for the C5 generation car was to take it mid-engined, but that didn't happen. Instead, the car remained front-engined, rear-wheel drive, two-seater with a variety of different body styles, up until this landed in 2020, which I know is actually 67 years after the car was launched, but doesn't sound as good, does it? Anyway, many of the key Corvette hallmarks are actually here, present and correct. This being American, let's start with the engine, shall we? Behind me, rather than in front of me, we have a classic Chevrolet small block, displacing 6.2 litres and of course with natural aspiration. It is, as before, dry sumped and has extra oil pumps to make sure that it's fed at all times. It produces in America just shy of 500 horsepower, but here in Europe, with its particulate filters, a little bit less, 482. Torque is just over 460 pound-foot, that's 630 newton-meters. And, as you might imagine, it doesn't exactly love to rev. In fact, the yellow line on the counter here starts at just 5.5, with the red at 6.5. Far more interesting though is what that engine is attached to, because here you have, for the first time in I think Corvette and possibly General Motors history, an 8-speed dual clutch transmission, developed, I believe, for this car by Tremec. Though I know many are absolutely delighted about this because it gives the Corvette a transmission that can keep up with its European rivals, and there are quite a few that are less happy because it replaces both the old 8-speed auto, which wasn't really that good, and the 7-speed manual. That's right, there is no longer a manual Corvette. And I must confess, I'm a little bit sad about that. In fact, I really think that Chevrolet should have continued making the Corvette as they had, front engine, rear-wheel drive with the option of a manual gearbox. Then they should have introduced a whole new model, essentially like the Z06, so high revving, fancy V8, flashy gearbox and all that, but starting at a much higher price, £140,000, £150,000, and that would have been a more genuine rival for the likes of your Ferraris, your top-end Porsches and so. By trying to continue offering a car in both lower and higher specifications, I do worry that Chevrolet may have wound up compromising them both. But dig deeper into the spec list and you really wouldn't feel that way. As previous, the car has a chiefly aluminium structure draped in a composite bodywork. Somehow though, despite all of that, it's still quite heavy, weighing the thick end of 1.7 tons, and I really don't know how they've managed that. The suspension setup is double wishbone, front and rear, available with optional magnetic ride, which this car has. Here in Europe, all cars are also at a higher specification than the base model in the USA. So our minimum here is what we call the 2LT, the base in America being the 1LT, and they all come with the Z51 performance package. So that features uprated brakes, better suspension, better cooling, an electronic limited slip differential at the back, and a few other tweaks too. I have to say though, when you do see things like uprated cooling as part of a performance pack, you do kind of worry that maybe the regular car just isn't good enough, especially when they think it should be standard fit in Europe and not in Texas. Anyway, that's not really a concern. What is more of a worry for me is the fact that even here, with said performance package, the brakes don't look all that mighty. They're hardly enormous. The wheels here, by the way, are 19-inch at the front and 20 at the back. Tyres are 245 and 305. But the brakes, they're not even grooved. They're not drilled. I know some people don't like drilled, and I get that. But you would expect for something that claims to do 180 plus mile an hour and 0 to 60 in less than 4 seconds, something a little bit more impressive for its stoppers, wouldn't you? The interior is a point of great interest. Depending on how you see it, it's either a great step forwards or a great step backwards. In terms of material quality, it's very good, plenty of leather all over the place. The Bose stereo is pretty decent too. Americans do love their stereos. The Quartic wheel I'm not exactly a massive fan of, and the buttons on it aren't particularly easy to get to. It also likes to turn the heating function on if it thinks you're a little bit too chilly, which is easy enough to get rid of, but isn't something that Mick, the owner, is particularly fond of. The seats I really do quite like. They hug you a lot more than you might expect. They've got plenty of adjustment, all electric, and memory functionality as well. They're also both heated and ventilated. In fact, a C7 generation Corvette was one of the first cars I ever got in with ventilated seats. And I have to say, on a summer's day, I really do appreciate that. I do also like the overall shape of the thing, and they certainly give you enough tech. You've got a heads-up display, fully digital dash, and a little digital screen here too. But it doesn't really appear as if any thought has gone into the ergonomics of the thing. This strip of switches over here is absolutely daft. This is a prime example of something that has been styled, not designed. First off, all these switches all together, all feeling very similar, is just awkward, silly, and unnecessarily difficult to use. More than that though, if you're a passenger in this car and you're just sat there as passengers do, this little strip here will basically be trying to cut your arm in half. That's not nice. And there are still a few little signs in here that General Motors is a company that does like to cut a few corners. The whole infotainment is just a little bit too slow to respond. Even changing between the driving modes is really frustrating. In just about everything I've ever driven, it's an instant thing. Click the button, turn the wheel, flip the lever, whatever, it just works. In here, no. Like in a 458, and apparently Chevrolet did heavily benchmark that Ferrari when building this, only 10 years too late, you get told exactly what each mode does. So you've got weather, tour, sport, and they adjust things like the steering, the suspension, the brake feel, the engine and gear change, the engine sound, and the PTM, which I think is a sort of performance aid. I'm now in track mode, and the car's stiffened up, and one thing I will say for it over the old C7 in that, between the different modes, the dampers didn't really seem to change. In here, massive difference. In tour, this is a ludicrously comfortable car. In fact, I might actually go as far as to say it's overly soft, because go over the odd pothole and the like, and the car will crash into the ground if it's run out of suspension travel. Doesn't feel that well set up. And naturally, there is also a customizable mode too. You have a bevy of cameras in this thing, enabling you to park fairly easily, including one exactly where you'd expect it, and another where you wouldn't, up here. That is there because flick the lever here on the rearview mirror, and it turns into a display, which is kind of funky, but ultimately, well, not useless, because without it you can't really see much behind you, but it's odd, to say the least. So, I don't know about you, but I've had enough of talking about specifications. I want to drive this car and see what it's like. To that end, I've set up the Z mode, how I like it. So, steering is in full weighting, suspension in its halfway house sport mode, engine, gear change, brake feel, they're all in full attack, as is engine sound. The PTM I've just left alone because I don't really understand it, and I think it changes other stuff as well. I did try playing about with it a minute ago. But let's get some clear road and see whether Chevrolet really have built a cut price 458, because if they have, this is going to be one of the most significant cars I have ever driven. Well, I hate to say this, I really do, but the C8 Chevrolet Corvette Stingray is a spectacular miss. And before you think that's because I'm British and I just don't like American cars by default, I assure you that is not the case. I love the C7. I'm desperate to get my hands on a C6. And the C5, I think, even in left-hand drive, guys, is a car worth buying because it's one of the most engaging, most exciting cars you can buy for the money. It's fabulous and criminally underrated, not just here either. But this, I don't know how they've managed it, but Chevrolet have got this so badly wrong. And I've got to say, it starts with the moment that you look at it. Because though I know a lot of people seem to love the way that this car looks, I think it's atrocious, absolutely awful. Were I 19, I'd probably love it. But to my eyes now, it just looks wrong. And it appears as if the poor designer hasn't really been at fault, because it looks to me like the people at GM said, you know what? We want this car to look very clearly like an evolution of the C7. That was a fine looking thing, but the problem is that was a front engine car. This is a mid-engined one. So they've tried to sort of pull some of the styling cues through from that car to this, and it doesn't look right. It looks like one of those internet mock-ups where someone's tried to draw their idea of a mid-engine C7. It looks like what I'd get if I asked an AI to draw me a mid-engine Corvette. It's just off. Everything about it is off. You do have both a boot and a fruit, so you've got a reasonable amount of storage, and as a tourer, it would be a very good thing. As with just about every Corvette coupe, it's also got a removable targa panel, but it's chilly enough today that I'm going to do without. There is also a folding hardtop convertible, but it just doesn't sit right to my eyes. There's so much going on at the rear in particular. The front I can just about get over, but the back is so fussy and doesn't know what it wants to do. It has no real identity, but does just look like a bit of a dog's dinner. And though the panel gaps and things all seem generally pretty okay, there's still a pervading sense of cheapness the more that you look at it. The engine bay, for example, it's not pretty, it's not flashy, it's not showy like in Italian supercars. And though I suppose you could say, yeah, but it's not priced like one, that's true, but they could have put a little bit more effort in, I think. Some of the fixtures and fittings that are on show just seem cheap. They really do. But all of that I would have been absolutely willing to forgive if this car drove as I expected it to, which is brilliantly. But it doesn't. And they've managed to get nearly every single element wrong. Let's start with the engine. It's pretty good. It's strong, it pulls hard from fairly low down, but it never really seems to shove you in the back as much as you might expect something with this much power and torque to do. It also is basically done by 5,000 RPM, and that I can also live with, but it doesn't even make a nice sound. It's not even that it's a nice V8 noise, but it's been muted by the particulate filters. It's odd, like they've tried to make it sound like a flat plane crank, only it hasn't worked. And in here, it almost sounds a bit McLaren-like at moments. It's not like I would expect a Corvette to sound. It's not like I would expect an Italian supercar to sound. It's not really anything. The oddest engine note since the 4-cylinder Boxster. That's the in-cabin sound. Not bad, and there's quite a lot of it, but it's just not what I'd expect. Credit where credit is due though, the gearbox is absolutely sensational. In auto mode it does a brilliant facsimile of a torque converter, and then when you want to have a play, it responds fantastically. Doesn't have the crack or the bite of some Italian stuff, but it does the job brilliantly, and for a first attempt is excellent. In fact, I recall seeing many people saying they weren't at all sure how Chevrolet were developing a proper dual clutch that worked well and were able to sell it in a car priced as low as this and still turn a profit. We'll get onto pricing in a little bit, but somehow they did. This works, and works well. Next up against the wall for JAYEMM's firing squad, the suspension. When you're just pottering around like I am now, doing 40 odd mile an hour in tour mode, in automatic, just chilling out, it's soft, it's comfy, it's lovely, but it is quite floaty. It's constantly doing that, the car. And then when it encounters something even semi-challenging, it does seem to thump into the road regardless. So you go, okay, let's compromise. Track is far, far, far too stiff, and it's labeled track mode. I'm not on a track, that's fine. So you think, okay, I'll go into sport mode. Surely that's the best compromise. But no, it's then too firm. Thumps down the road all the time. It never settles. It never feels quite right. And I don't know how they've managed that. And then for me, the dynamic killer blow, the steering. Totally inert all the time, absolutely lifeless, and on occasion a little bit disconcerting. In sport mode, it's not great. In track, it's just too firm and actually really resists some of your inputs, so you dial it back to sport or tour, and then it's just light and lifeless. Really horrid. Another thing I will actually say for this car, I do love the throttle pedal. It must be the most linear of any modern car I've ever driven. You want the full performance, you really got to push that pedal all the way to the ground. All the way. Not that quick. It's just not. I'm sorry, I'm sure a lot of people are going to be upset about that, but it isn't. I really genuinely thought that this was going to be a car that made the Lotus Emira redundant. The opposite is actually true. Unless you need a roof that comes down, the Emira absolutely wipes the floor with the Corvette. Looks better, sounds decent too, although which you prefer is up to you. Drives miles better, and is so much more communicative, even though on paper it's a much slower car. In the real world, on these roads, you will be going faster if that's your kind of bag. Some more good things for the Corvette. Visibility overall is very good, and you've got a view over your shoulder, which you don't in many a car, and it's actually pretty decent. The cameras help you when you're maneuvering, and that's fine. Economy is also very impressive. During that little stint there, I've been averaging just under 20, but the car actually can do about 35, so that's not so bad for something with this amount of power carrying this amount of weight. And I know there are people out there for whom a lot of this really doesn't matter. It's entirely irrelevant. They're quite happy buying this because it's something different, something unusual, and that's one of the reasons that Mick has had a lifelong obsession with the Corvette. He bought his first way back in 1979. He's had a C3, C5, C7s. He's now got this and has another one on order. But from my perspective, one of the biggest problems with having a Corvette in Britain, especially a new one, is that we currently have only one official dealer. Ian Allen Motors. I've dealt with them once before, and they were utterly useless. So much so that at the time I went, that's it, I'm never buying a Corvette. And though many people have had a good experience, including Mick, he said some of his previous cars, they've been absolutely fine. Unfortunately though, my experience is not an isolated incident, and I know many people who've tried to deal with them and come away very, very dissatisfied. And when you've only got one dealer in the entire country, that's a bit of a problem. In fact, they cover more than one country because they do England, Wales and Scotland, and they're just not good enough. Simple as, I could not imagine owning one of these up in Scotland. To have to go all the way to Surrey to a dealer that isn't very good to try and get stuff done? Nah, deal breaker. As, unfortunately, is the price. This car was £83,000, but if you wanted to buy its equivalent today, you're going to have to add about 10,000 quid to that. It turns out many people suspecting Chevrolet were selling these too cheap may have been right, because the prices have all gone up by quite a bit. And though on paper this is a huge amount of car for the money, in the composite for me, it really does fall short. This is a great disappointment. I'm still desperate to get my hands on a Z06 because there's every chance with that they could have nailed it. This is, after all, their first attempt at doing a mid-engined car. And they need to improve because this is a long way short of the benchmark. So, C8 generation Chevrolet Corvette Stingray, points for effort, not for results. Must try harder, Chevrolet. And I hope you do, because I look forward to that. Anyway, a huge thank you to Mick for bringing his car out and allowing me to drive it, and as ever, to you for watching. Don't forget to hit the like button, comment down below, subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you for the next one. Bye-bye.